Thank you. Truly a pleasure, an honor to stand before you today. I first want to thank the Woodland Hills High School and the wonderful staff that I've had a chance to meet thus far. And indeed, as Mr. Bunt said, I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and perspectives on this very important affair. Again, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and this history of the French and Indian War was something that deeply interested me when I was growing up here. And I took that interest into graduate, and I did my doctorate in history at the College of William and Mary, and I began to study more intently the 18th century and this whole story of how the French, the British, and the Native Americans had once vied for control of this continent. And it just so happens that Western Pennsylvania, what is now Western PA, was really the focal point of conflict in this very tumultuous period that we know of as the French and Indian War. Now, being at the where I teach military history to a lot of terrific cadets, sailors and Marines, it's been a real privilege to teach at the Citadel, and my cadets have shaped this project in so many ways. I've had a few students who have been deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. They're combat veterans, and those students in particular really gave me a lot of wonderful insights onto to this project. And so I now want to turn to why I wrote a book, Braddock's Defeat. In a nutshell, and what I would ask you to remember from this time is that Braddock's defeat was the single most important battle in American history before 1775, which is to say the beginning of the American Revolution. The most important battle in American history before 1775. And this is a story that unfolds right in your backyard. And so I hope that there's an intrinsic interest there. This is also a battle that we think that we know everything there is to know. You know, when I was in high school, I thought that history was a done deal, that we knew everything that had happened, and of remembering dates and names and facts, things that happened. But as I studied history, I realized and came to see that history is really a process of discovery, and it's a search for evidence about the past. And so history is constantly changing, it's constantly evolving as we find out new sources of information. And that was indeed my challenge when I was writing this book. I remember that I had friends and colleagues who said, Preston, what are you gonna say that's new about the Battle of Braddock's defeat? It's been done. We already know about it. Well, one of my goals in this project was to search out new sources of information. And so my research took me from the United States to Canada to Britain to France, and I was researching in the actual documents in archives and libraries all across those areas. And indeed, I found completely new sources of information about this battle. Now, this painting is by Manuel Leutze. He was a 19th century artist. It's entitled Washington at the Battle of Monongahela. Most of you are probably familiar with his more famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, the icy Delaware River in December of 1776. And this battle this painting very much expresses a lot of the ideas that we've inherited about Braddock's defeat. that this was a battle in which the young George Washington, pictured here, distinguished himself, and indeed he. It's also a battle where it is a disaster that is laid squarely on the shoulders of General Edward Braddock. And he is often seen as one of the most pilloried, most criticized generals in all of history for his alleged mistakes and blunders that he committed in this battle. I wanted to find out, again, what really happened at Braddock's defeat, if there was new sources of information that we could find. And growing up in Western Pennsylvania, that was something that aided my research, because I was well familiar with a lot of these places. And so again, as we go, I want you to remember that this important battle, this important story that changes the course of American history, it occurred right in your backyard. This is a picture on the south side of the Mon looking up towards Braddock and North Braddock. The battle unfolded on the side of this ridge right here. So let's begin with General Edward Braddock. What do we know about this man? He was a career officer in the British Army in the 18th century. He had served for many decades in the British Army, as most officers did at that time. And as I mentioned before, historians have criticized him for all sorts of errors. Primarily, Braddock kind of gets stereotyped as this really headstrong, arrogant individual who kind of marches into the wilderness, into the woods, gets attacked by the French and Indians and destroyed. I found that a lot of those inherited understandings about General Braddock were either inaccurate or just altogether false when I actually looked at the historical record pertaining to this officer. So here's one example of a discovery that I made during the course of my research. I went to the Royal Library located at Windsor Castle in England, which is one of the Queen's residences. And in the Royal Library there, I found a manuscript written by General Braddock. And it was pertaining to his time as commander of a very important British post or garrison called Gibraltar, located in the Mediterranean. It was arguably one of the most important British garrisons of all. And Braddock was entrusted with command of this garrison in 1753 and 54. So that's 2 years before he comes to America. And I did something that previous scholars had not really done, and that is to actually look at the records pertaining to Braddock's time at Gibraltar. It turns out that this officer did a very thorough and effective job. He earned a lot of praise for his conduct as the lieutenant governor of the garrison, as well as the commander-in-chief of the British forces that were there. And his time at Gibraltar very much equipped the general for the type of environment that he would encounter in America. For example, Gibraltar was a very multi-ethnic place because it sits really at the junction of Europe and Africa. So Braddock would have been a diplomat in his role as lieutenant governor of the island. General Braddock, therefore, had a good degree of experience in diplomacy in a multi-ethnic setting. So when he comes to America, for instance, and when he is expected by the king of Britain to cultivate good relations with the Native Americans that he will encounter here, Braddock has already had experience in that type of setting. Very quickly, we're just going to review some of the background to the Battle of the Monongahela, or Braddock's defeat. In the 1750s, the Ohio Valley was indeed one of the most places in North America strategically. For the French, the Ohio Valley was a route to their possessions in the West, places like Illinois and Louisiana. For the British, in Pennsylvania and Virginia, the Ohio Valley was also a gateway to the wealth and the resources of the West. And so both of these empires were very much vying for control of this land. The Indian peoples who lived in this region, primarily the Delawares, the Shawnees, the Ohio Iroquois, for them the Ohio Valley was home. And they were determined to preserve their independence and their autonomy, despite what the French and the British wanted to do with the region. The first sparks of what becomes the French and Indian War involved George Washington, the future commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, the future first president of the United States. He gets involved with two skirmishes with the French near what is today Fort Necessity or Jumonville. And it's very much these early skirmishes between the Virginians and the French and the Indians that results in the British government making a very momentous decision in late 1754 to send General Braddock with 2 regiments of redcoats. These are regular British Army soldiers, and the British government will send these troops to America to help solve this growing dispute between Britain and France in the Ohio Valley. The French very much struck first in this whole affair. They would build a series of forts along around Lake Erie and then along the Allegheny River, all the way down to what was called then the Forks of the Ohio. And that's where Point State Park is today. And this is a map of Fort Duquesne, which was the principal and most powerful French fort that they constructed in this region. Powerful enough that the British would have needed cannons or artillery to actually besiege this post and force the French to surrender or destroy it. Fort Duquesne's footprint can still be seen in Point State Park. That's the footprint right there of Fort Duquesne and its actual site. I'm always thankful that the flight paths coming into Pittsburgh usually go right over the city, so I was able to snap this photo looking out the window of my plane. The 2 regiments that General Braddock has under his command were the 44th and the 48th regiments. These are infantry units of the regular British Army. And these are paintings of some of the soldiers in the different regiments in the 1750s. So here is a soldier of the 44th Regiment. Over here is a soldier of the 48th. These were paintings, by the way, of the grenadiers in these units, which were considered kind of the shock troops of each British regiment. These were supposed to be professional troops, professional soldiers, disciplined soldiers that had training in warfare and hopefully experience as well. I had to do a lot of background research on these 2 units. I needed to know, for example, what degree of experience they had militarily before they come over here to Virginia in early 1755. And few scholars had actually bothered to really investigate the backgrounds of these units to find out where they had fought previously, what kind of engagements they had been involved in. What was the nature of the training they had? Was their training something that would equip them to fight in the woods in America or to deal with French and Indian foes? In a nutshell, I got involved in living history or reenacting, and I learned tremendously about how the British Army in the 18th century functioned. I learned about the uniforms, the equipment, the weaponry of the British Army. And this is an excellent illustration of a volley fire that these men would have been trained to. That is, they're sending concentrated lead from those muskets downrange at the enemy. See, I had read in accounts of Braddock's defeat that British soldiers fired through all of their ammunition by the end of the battle. And I wanted to know, for example, well, what happens when you fire 30 or 40 rounds of ammunition through the British muskets of that period? How did they function? Did they function? I found that after 30 rounds, those muskets were very difficult to load. They were also very difficult to fire even after that many rounds. The uniform that I brought with me today is a very authentic reproduction of the uniform of the 44th Regiment. This is called a regimental coat. I also have a waistcoat underneath, which is kind of the standard fare for British Army soldier in the 18th century. And you're welcome, as Mr. Bunt said, feel free to come up here and look at this, feel how heavy it is. It's made out of heavy wool. The color is, it's called madder red because there's a plant called the madder plant to produce that red dye. Now, you might wonder, why did the British wear such gaudy uniforms, brightly colored uniforms? And this illustration here shows 9/10 of the reason why. You see how much white smoke those muskets are producing? So imagine firing 20 or 30 volleys like that. Pretty soon, the field would be completely obscured with white smoke. How do you figure out who is friend and foe? Well, these uniforms help. Each regiment had different colors of facings and cuffs, and also turnbacks here. Each regiment also had different colors and patterns of lace on the borders of the garment. It's kind of difficult to think that there were British soldiers fighting in the woods with these brightly colored uniforms. And as we'll see, the against them at Braddock's defeat would have no problem in perceiving the locations of British soldiers. So, General Braddock's army is transported across the Atlantic Ocean, courtesy of the Royal Navy, beginning in January of 1755. They land in Virginia, first near Hampton in Virginia, and then they're eventually transported up to Alexandria. From there, they will march from Virginia overland, and they will eventually make their way to Fort Cumberland in western Maryland, which is where is located today. This is a map showing the route of General Braddock's road that he built across the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Monongahela River, where he would meet with disaster on July 9th. This led me to one of the next phases of my research, which was to investigate General Braddock's road that he constructed across the mountains. This was a 10 to 12 foot wide wagon road because General Braddock needed to bring wagons, supply wagons. He was also bringing heavy cannons that could weigh up to a ton, even over a ton in weight. So he needed to construct a wagon road that would get those items across the rugged mountains. And this was an aspect of the story that was really amazing to me. And indeed, it was so for the British soldiers themselves. One British officer named William Spark of the 48th Regiment wrote afterwards, we began our march, but surely such a one was never undertaken before. I apprehend it will be looked upon as romantic by those who did not see and therefore cannot comprehend the difficulties of that march. In order for me as a historian to comprehend what this soldier was talking about and to comprehend the difficulties of that march, I had to go out and trace the road myself. And this was one of the joys of the research. I walked a lot of Braddock's Road with a person that's now a dear friend, Norman Baker. He is very much the foremost scholar of Braddock's Road. And he also happens to be a World War II and Korean War veteran. So he was my traveling companion as we traced sections of Braddock's Road. This is a section, an old trace of Braddock's Road, still in the mountains in western Maryland, a place called Big Savage Mountain. And I have to say that it wasn't until I actually saw these places with my own eyes that I really understood the written sources that we have about the campaign. Because I could read a British soldier's account who had gone up this really horrendously steep slope and understand the problems of getting wagons across such an enormous mountain, nearly 3,000 feet in elevation. I could begin to understand the wear and tear on the horses, on the men who had to construct this road. A lot of the boulders that you're looking at here, probably some of those were the same ones that had to be blasted away with gunpowder because they moved them otherwise. So it really alerted me to the sheer grunt labor involved in getting across the mountains. And that, in turn, allowed me to see General Braddock's Road as one of his greatest accomplishments. That this is an officer who successfully got his army across the mountains. He overcame tremendous difficulties in supplying his men, and he brings his army to the very cusp of victory here at the Monongahela in 1755. The next part of my research involved, in a simple way, actually looking at the enemy forces that General Braddock faced during this whole affair. It really boggles my mind that no previous scholars had deeply investigated the French or the Indian sides of this whole story. There is an abundance of sources in the French language in places like Paris, in Canada, that pertain to this whole story. And that was also a very eye-opening part of the research experience. The French commander on the day of the battle is this officer. His full name is Captain Daniel Hyacinthe Marie Léonard de Beaujeu. Captain Beaujeu. born in 1711, and he dies during the battle in 1755. This miniature portrait of him, by the way, was given to his wife on the occasion of their marriage in the year 1737. I did a lot of research on Captain Beaujeu that led me to sources, again, that previous scholars had not looked at. I was able to find, just as an example, a journal written by Captain Beaujeu in the previous war fought in America in the 1740s. Captain Beaujeu was a combat veteran by the time he came here to the Ohio Valley in 1755. This was a man with deep experience in how to fight in the wilderness. He also had a lot of diplomatic skill because he had been stationed at all sorts of forts and posts in Canada. And so Captain Beaujeu was used to dealing with Native Americans as allies. And this is the officer who, as I'll show you, ultimately is responsible for the defeat of General Braddock in 1755. Because Americans never looked deeply at the French side, they missed one of the most important and amazing stories of the whole campaign. You know, as significant as Braddock's road over the mountains was, how about this? Captain Beaujeu in April of 1755 will depart from the city of Montreal in Canada, and he's going to lead reinforcements and convoys of supplies by boat from Montreal 700 miles up the St. Lawrence River, across Lake Ontario. They have to portage around Niagara Falls, so they've got to take all their boats out of the water, all their supplies, haul them across land, and so that they can get over to Lake Erie. And then when they come here to Fort Presque Isle, which is where modern Erie, Pennsylvania is located, they have to portage again and drag those supplies in canoes 16 miles overland to what was called, at that time, Rivière au Boeuf. Today it's known as French Creek, French Creek, as I called it growing up. I've lost my accent being in South Carolina for so long. And then they had to float down the Allegheny River here to Fort Duquesne, 700 miles through incredibly treacherous and dangerous waterways. These are the kinds of craft that the French were using. They're called bateaux, very large craft that were capable of transporting and hauling a significant degree of supplies. To understand the French side, I needed to investigate these waterways. And so that's what led me to canoe French Creek, as well as sections of the Allegheny with my lovely wife as my traveling companion. So the French were able to collect a serious degree of force at Fort Duquesne. On the day of the battle, there will be roughly about 250 French Marines, and as well as Canadian militia, that will go out and do battle against the British. But more significantly, look at the numbers. There are 600 to 700 Indian allies who were fighting with the French that day. What that means is that two-thirds of the whole force that defeats Braddock are Native American warriors. And to me, that says a lot. Again, previous scholars had never looked intently at who these Indians were, where they're coming from, why they're fighting with the French that day. And so that was another key aspect of the research. I found that the French, through their alliances, were able to gain the support of natives from three different areas, from Canada, from the Great Lakes area. So there are natives as far west as Lake Superior, even the Mississippi Valley, who were coming here to the Ohio in 1755 to fight with their French allies. And then there was also a significant number of local natives who were also fighting with the French. I also had to figure out some of the road networks, or paths, I should say, that existed in this area. Where did General Braddock intend to go as he closed in on Fort Duquesne in early July 1755? So here's Braddock's road coming into what's now modern McKeesport. If you're all familiar with the Route 837 bridge going over to McKeesport, that's roughly where General Braddock crossed the Monongahela the first time. And then he marched along the south side of the Mon, and he'll cross the Monongahela again right where the Edgar Thompson Steelworks is today. And these were the locations of two fords where the soldiers could basically wade across the river at knee-deep level. This is a very majestic painting by a modern artist, Robert Griffing, of that second crossing of the Monongahela River. George Washington, who was a member of General Braddock's staff on the day of the battle, he remembered this as a majestic spectacle of British might. The soldiers by this point were euphoric because they had accomplished so much. And when the French and the Indians weren't there on the opposite side of the river, where they expected, would have been a likely ambush location. They felt that basically the coast was clear, and that after 1 or 2 days' march to Fort Duquesne, that they would be able to corner the French and force them to abandon Fort Duquesne. This is the modern equivalent of that painting. Just to kind of scroll back and forth here. So over here is the Edgar Thompson Works, and the British Army is going to be crossing right about here, and then marching up towards what is now North Braddock. This is a painting that's currently housed at Fort here, in just east of here. And this is a wonderful painting that gives us a sense of what the British soldiers saw that day. This is basically where Braddock and North Braddock are today. And so the battle will unfold right on the side of this ridge line. About the only difference in this painting between what the British soldiers would have seen is this area would have still been heavily forested, as opposed to some of the farmland that you're seeing here. This painting was done in the 1850s. This is roughly the same view today of that artist's portrayal. So again, here's Braddock and North Braddock, and the battle's going to unfold right in this area. As I researched the actual battle itself, most historians writing before me had always emphasized what the British did wrong. It was the fault of the British for losing this battle. General Braddock's errors in judgment, wrong decisions that the British made, wrong moves that the British made during the battle. One of the most significant discoveries that I made in the research was finding an entirely new account of the battle written about the French commander, Captain Beaujeu. I'm going to come back to this map in just a moment. But this account was drawn from an archive in Normandy, in France. And it really shed a powerful light for me on the actions of the French commander during the battle. And it heightened my sense that this was a battle that was not Braddock's defeat, but more so Captain Beaujeu's victory, that he had won through his superior intelligence of the British, through his superior tactics and use of his forces. So this is just a short extract from certain of the enemy's position. Monsieur de Beaujeu divided the Indian nations and spread them out on both sides of the road in the woods. So if you go to this map, I'll put this one up here as well. What I wanted to show on the map was how Captain Beaujeu and the natives attacked this British column. The British indeed were in a column formation after they had crossed the Monongahela River. And a column is one of the most difficult military formations to defend because the soldiers were strung out roughly about 1 mile in length. And even though the British had flanking parties here, these were small detachments of British redcoats out in the woods helping to shield the army from any type of attack. Even though the British had taken those precautions against a French and Indian attack, here is how the French and the natives are able to destroy this British force. As that account said, Captain Beaujeu, he will lead his French and Canadian forces headlong. He will attack the British column right in front of him. And as the account said, he instructs the Indian nations, the Indian warriors with him, to deploy into the woods on either side of the British column. And then what the Indians do is that they essentially will fan out along the sides of the British column. And they will carry the fight all the way to the rear of the British army. What this does is that it instills an incredible degree of panic amidst the British ranks, disorganization, uncertainty. Remember that these were soldiers who a few moments before were just euphoric. They were full of confidence that this was going to be the end for the French and the Indians. This was a very unexpected attack from a very large force. The British will go into this battle with, in one tally, 1,469 personnel. And here are the grim odds for all of those British soldiers that day. 2 out of every 3 British soldiers who would cross the Monongahela would be in this battle in the space of about 4 hours. You know, having written a book on this subject, I still marvel at how the French and the Indians were able to accomplish this, to bring a seemingly well-organized, disciplined army that's full of confidence, and they basically reduce this force to a disorganized mob in the space of about 4 hours. It's a really staggering achievement. So we also have to give credit to the Native American warriors who really took the initiative to fan out along the flanks of the British column. And what they're doing is they're driving in the British flanking parties. They are instilling fear in the British ranks through their war cries. The Indians had, at least from the British perspective, very, very terrifying war cries that really magnified their numbers in the woods. I think if you were a typical British soldier standing in the ranks of that column, it probably sounded like there were 1,000 Indian warriors surrounding you, and they had no idea what was going to happen next. General Braddock tried his level best to make a defense, but there were very few. Maybe there's really no officer that could have salvaged victory out of this very impossible set of circumstances. As I mentioned before, the British Army is in a column. They're also with their back to the river. Getting back across the river would be a very difficult task while they're being attacked at the same time. There's no fallback point for the British soldiers. There's no fort nearby that they can take refuge or shelter in. And so it was a very difficult task. In addition, the native warriors are able to use the advantage of this high ground in what is now North Braddock to fire down onto these massive ranks of redcoats. And again, even with the smoke produced through the muskets, these British soldiers would have been very visible targets. We also know that the warriors were specifically targeting the officers of the British Army, who were very conspicuous, usually on horseback. Their uniforms were even more brightly colored. They had gold and silver lace on their uniforms, and they also had symbols of their command as officers that they wore around their necks. And we know from 1755 accounts that the French and the Indians were targeting specifically the British officers, which rendered the rest of the soldiers leaderless and helpless. Anybody recognize this scene? Okay. Very, very good. This is basically taken from, this is Jones Avenue in North Braddock. This is looking down towards Braddock. And this is really taken from the perspective of where the Indian warriors would have been doing great damage against the British. So right in this area here. And you can still perceive a lot of that high ground. You can still perceive elements of the terrain even today. This is a wonderful painting done by a modern artist, Robert Griffin, The Wounding of General Braddock. And it shows the moment late in the battle when General Braddock was wounded. He's toppled from a horse as he's trying to mount it. And this was really the moment in the battle when the British really broke as a military force. Up until Braddock's wounding, the British had tried to fight as best they could in their massed ranks, and even amidst their disorganization and chaos and panic. One of the persons pictured here is George Washington. As I mentioned earlier, was an aide to the general. And I want you to think about this in terms of the importance of Braddock's defeat. This was George Washington's first major combat action, and he behaved with incredible valor and distinction. Even British officers praised the conduct of Washington. And we know from records at that time that Washington had 2 horses shot from under him during the battle, and he also had bullet holes through his clothing and his hat. So ask yourself, how would history have been different? How would it have changed if George Washington, the young George Washington, had been killed outright at Braddock's defeat? There would have been no General Washington crossing the Delaware or as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. There would have been no future president. And Washington was very much seared from his experience here at the Monongahela. It was very much a kind of crucial moment in his life. As I mentioned before, the casualties at Braddock's defeat are enormous. According to one account, 976 of the 1,469 soldiers in the battle are killed. That's 66%. Just really staggering casualties. And at very minimal cost. The French and the Indians had won arguably one of the greatest victories, one of the most lopsided victories in all of military history, losing a few dozen killed and wounded. General Braddock would die in a few days, and his remains are actually buried today near Chalk Hill, Pennsylvania, literally beside U-40. And this is actually an extant section of Braddock that goes by his grave site. What were the consequences of Braddock's defeat? This was a battle, as I said, that changed American history in a number of important ways. First of all, it really escalated this conflict into what we know became the French and Indian War, which became part of a larger struggle that was happening all around the world called the 7 Years' War. The battle also showed the British and the British colonists too that they had to adapt militarily to how to fight in the woods against mobile French and Indian opponents who were very skilled in this type of warfare. We also know that the British were determined to avenge Braddock's defeat, which they did successfully in the year 1758. And in that year, another British army, commanded by John Forbes, you've all heard Forbes' name before in this area. Forbes cuts across Pennsylvania, and he accomplishes what Braddock failed to do in 1755. And Forbes will capture Fort Duquesne and the Forks of the Ohio. What that means is that when the British are able to control the Ohio Valley, all of those settlers back east, across the mountains, they now have two wagon roads, Forbes's Road and Braddock's Road, going across what had been before a completely impenetrable barrier. And so Braddock's defeat shaped the lives of every single person in this room by virtue of how the aftermath allowed the British to access and to settle the Ohio Valley here. By the 1840s, the area that we know of as Braddock or North Braddock, it was known then as Braddock's Field, and that was where the battle had unfolded. By the way, there were so many dead soldiers left on the field that for decades afterwards, people were still finding bones on Braddock's Field. It was a very haunting place for travelers to come through. That settlement made Pittsburgh into the gateway to the American West. And over time, Pittsburgh will become the greatest steel producing area in the United States. This is roughly that same view in that previous scene. And this is the part of the Edgar Thomson works. And this is the same view today. The last thing I want to say is as encouragement to all of the students here is my book was premised on the participation and the help of so many individuals. And I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that people who work in the field of history shaped my book, my ability to do my book at all. I dealt with historians who serve in the armed forces. I dealt with museum curators. I talked with National Park Service historians and staff members. This is one pictured here, and he was showing us a log that was part of the original Fort Necessity that George Washington built in 1754. All of those archives and libraries that I visited, those records are maintained by archivists and librarians. And if it wasn't for them, I would not have been able to go to these places and find out new things. Staff at historic sites in the area were crucial. Historic preservation organizations. Archaeologists have done work on certain aspects of my research. There's a gentleman here today who was very formative in the research process for me, and his name is Robert Mesner, and I was just blessed to encounter him during my research. He has been Braddock's defeat, the story of Braddock's defeat, for a long time, and it was really his passion for this subject that he really has done tremendous efforts to bring attention to the actual site of Braddock's battlefield. And it was his vision and his enterprise that has resulted in a new museum that's opened in Braddock, right along 6th Avenue. I encourage you all to visit that museum, and also visit the Braddock Carnegie Library, where that beautiful portrait, a painting of Emanuel Leutz still hangs. Thank you so much for your attention today, and I'd be delighted to hear your questions or comments in our time remaining. Thank you. Yes. Very good question. There actually was a small company of Royal Navy sailors who were part of the expedition. However, in this case, Leutz's depiction of Washington in a blue was a reflection of basically the American provincial soldiers who were part of this expedition. A lot of them would have worn blue coats.
How did they fare in the battle?
The American provincials, much to their pride, they fought with greater effectiveness than the British redcoats did. In the press at that period, the early newspaper accounts that come out of the battle, many of those accounts will praise the conduct of the American troops who were with Braddock. And largely the explanation for why they fought with such effectiveness was the fact that at least some of them had previous experience fighting in the woods. Some of these Virginians who had fought at Braddock's defeat had encountered natives and French the year before at the Battle of Fort Necessity. That's a great question. Yes. The question is, what advice do you have for students who want to write books? My simple advice is that any one of you is capable of writing a book. It really it has to come from the heart. For me, it was a long research process. I encourage you to read the works of historians, of journalists, and get ideas. Develop your own voice. One of the things that I did as part of the research too was I read a lot of accounts written by recent journalists who had been embedded in Iraq and Afghanistan with our forces there, and those writers really gave me a sense of how to describe the experience of combat or battle. So for me personally, reading some of those recent war journalists' accounts was a really great tool for me. Yes, sir.
You might want to mention about the leader of the French and what happened to him in the battle.
Yes, I mentioned very briefly that he would be killed in this battle. Indeed, he was, according to French accounts, he was killed in the earliest volleys of the battle. One French account says that his body was found afterwards in a terrain feature that the British called the ravine, or sometimes they called it a gully, and that ravine roughly corresponds to 6th Street in Braddock today. And I think that the Braddock's Battlefield History Center is located literally where the fighting first broke out in 1755, and where Captain Beaujeu's body was found. His body, by the way, was taken back to Fort Duquesne and buried in the fort cemetery. Unfortunately, we really have no idea today where that French cemetery was located. And so perhaps somewhere around modern-day Point State Park lie the mortal remains of Captain Beaujeu.
Dr. Preston, we want to thank you for coming again. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. And one last thing I want to do is to present a copy of my book to the Woodland Hills High School Library.
Thank you.
With the pledge that I'm always able and willing to help this school in any way that I can.
Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.